Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome and thank you for attending our final webinar for the year about novel benzodiazepines and counterfeit products on the market, particularly here in Australia. My name's Rita Bryan. I'm the Senior Project Officer in Workforce Development at Pennington Institute, and I'm joined by Cameron Francis, who's the CEO of the Loop Australia, who I'll introduce properly in a moment. But just a little bit about Pennington Institute. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We focus on supporting cost-effective approaches that maximise community health and safety in relation to drugs, including pharmaceuticals and alcohol. I'm joining you all today from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country and would like to, as always, acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I live and work, pay my personal respects to Aboriginal elders, past and present, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands where you guys are joining us from today, mostly across this big country that we now call Australia. Just a little bit of a housekeeping and format for today before we kick off. We've got a 60-minute webinar, so 1 hour, and Cameron's our only presenter today, talking to us for about 35 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time at the end for some live audience Q&A. The webinar today is being recorded. It will be made available on the Pennington Institute website over the next few days, but we do welcome, and the chat function is disabled, apologies. So we do welcome you to use the Q&A function if you want to ask questions live in session. Just as a note, only myself and Cameron will be able to see the Q&A live during the session. But please use that and we will aim to get to as many questions as possible. Bear in mind, we might not be able to get to everything. If we don't, we'll review the questions after the session. And if we do miss anything important or pertinent queries, we can take these on notice and either provide some additional insights or links when the on-demand recording is made available. And Cameron will share his contact details if you have specific questions at the end. While we're not focusing directly about overdoses today, the following content does include some information related to lives lost and or injury or ill health related to drug use, or more so the circumstances that can lead to these outcomes. So I just want to give a little bit of a content warning that we do recognise this subject matter can trigger an emotional response for some people, and just want to remind everybody to take care of yourself, tread lightly and gently with this type of information, this subject matter, and with the people around you, especially at this time of year. It can be a really joyous time for most of us, but for some people it can be a really, really challenging time as well. So before we start, why are we hosting a webinar on novel benzodiazepines? Firstly, in our feedback in other webinars, you guys, a lot of you had asked for a topic, a webinar related to this topic. And I'm sure Cameron will speak much more detail about the properties and the pharmacology and history of benzodiazepines, their use, and then the emergence of novel substances in more recent years. But I just wanted to sort of quickly set the scene up for him first. Benzodiazepines, or benzos, which is a lot easier to say and less syllable, are a class of drugs that usually have anti-anxiety or sedative effects. They slow down breathing and other body functions, and we all know that there are many different types of benzodiazepine medications approved to treat disorders like anxiety, sleep problems, epilepsy. But this class of drugs vary quite widely in terms of their form, their strength, their onset and duration of effects, and therefore the experiences that people have, meaning care is required when prescribing them and or using them. And many novel benzodiazepines have actually been around for quite a while, but were either never approved as medicines due to their safety profile, and others might be approved as medicines in other countries, but not approved here in Australia by the TGA for use, for pharmaceutical use. And Cam will talk a lot more to you about how they're available and why they're available. But like any novel psychoactive substance, their effects on the brain and the body are not particularly well researched. And I think probably one of the bigger concerns is probably novel benzodiazepines have become increasingly used as substitutes in counterfeit products, sometimes sold and prescribed as legitimate medicines online. And those medicines are not really made, are very rarely made to the same standards as pharmaceutical drugs. So they can look a lot like the products you might get from a pharmacy or prescribed by a doctor, but with none of the assurances of, regulated medicines. So their ingredients can vary quite widely, pardon me, even within the same batch. So I'm sure you'll hear more about that today with Cam. I just want to sort of clarify that in a recent report from the Coroner's Court of Victoria that explored overdose deaths across a 10-year period, just to give you a bit of a scope on the state of play here in Victoria, novel benzodiazepines are actually the most frequently contributing novel psychoactive substance category in overdose deaths in 2023, as well as across the last decade more generally over the time that data has been recorded. And the most common detected substances in these deaths were some drugs that I definitely think Cam will talk to you about, atizolam and bromazolam. And it's just really interesting to note that in almost half, or just over 40% of the cases where novel benzodiazepines were involved, expert death investigators concluded that at least 2 or more novel benzodiazepines were contributing to those deaths. And specifically, the circumstances of those deaths suggested that in most cases, the deceased had consumed a single substance, usually a product or a tablet described as Xanax or similar, and that likely contained a combination of novel benzodiazepines. So we don't hear a lot about these in the media, but they are, or like we do with synthetic opioids at the moment, like nitazines or nitazines. But novel benzodiazepines and benzodiazepines more broadly do really contribute to a significant amount of harm. And that's why we've got Cameron with us today to bring us some of his expert insights and information and data and advice for frontline workers in the drug and alcohol sector. So after that, without further ado, I will introduce Cameron to you as he brings up his slides. So as Cameron's a very experienced and very passionate social worker with a 20-year track record, or 20 plus years record in the field of youth alcohol and other drugs. Throughout his career, Cameron has embraced diverse roles from leading peer education initiatives at music events and festivals, needle and syringe program work, individual counselling, as well as training and secondary consultation for complex youth AOD presentations. So he's been around for a bit. Cameron, as I said, serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the Loop Australia, which is currently delivering drug checking services in Queensland and very, very soon in Victoria as well. So Cam's going to present his data, and I might just throw straight over to you when you're ready to go, Cameron.
Thank you, Rita, for the intro. And hopefully screen sharing is working and will progress smoothly. Thank you for the intro. I'd like to also acknowledge traditional owners of the lands that everybody is meeting on today. I'm coming at you from Brisbane, Magunjan, which is Turrbal Yagara country up here in Queensland. And so I always want to just acknowledge our elders past and present. What I'm going to talk to you today about is about counterfeit benzos. Some of this is information that we've been getting from the CheQpoint drug checking services running here in Queensland, but there's sort of more than that as well. I want to talk a bit about some of the history of benzos generally in terms of how they first emerged and how they've sort of rolled through our community, because I think it's always important that we don't sort of think about counterfeit benzos or novel benzos that we're seeing at the moment. They didn't just appear out of thin air. They're actually just another iteration of an ongoing sort of progress we've seen with benzo use across the community, really since they were very first invented. CheQpoint, for those who don't know, CheQpoint is the drug checking service operating here in Queensland. It's a partnership between Quinn, Quiver and the Loop Australia. Quinn is our specialist, particularly injecting focus AOD service with 6 different locations around Queensland. Quiver is Queensland's peer-based drug user organisation, and the Loop Australia is a non-profit organisation set up to deliver drug checking services in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. We opened our first fixed site back in April. There's an image there of a certain premier staring over our chemist's shoulder. Our chemists love it when you do that. It's really awkward. But this service opened back in April. This was our Bowen Hill service, and our second service opened at the Gold Coast a couple of months later. If you've got any clients in Queensland or you're interested, we're open every Friday from 2 to 6, number 1 Hamilton Place in Bowen Hills. And we're also open 2 to 6 every Friday at Burleigh Heads as well. So the story of benzos is an interesting one in terms of like why they are here, what they exist to do. Benzos were invented, marketed, and sort of made popular in the 1960s, mostly as a way of replacing barbiturates. And barbiturates were in many ways more harmful than benzos. Barbiturates can cause pretty profound respiratory depression just on their own, and much more pronounced if it's combined with alcohol. Barbiturates also cause dependence as well. And, you know, all through the 1930s and 1940s, there was a lot of issues associated with barbiturates. Heaps of famous movie stars died from barbiturate overdose or dependence. You'll probably know some of the stories in popular culture. Benzos were marketed as a safe and non-addictive alternative to these previously dangerous drugs. And there's a long pattern of these types of pharmaceuticals. I mean, we've seen this with drugs like oxycodone as well, being marketed as the safe, non-addictive alternative to the other previously now terrible drug. This image on the screen at the moment, this is a real advertisement from the 1960s. And you can see that they were really marketed particularly towards women. In this case, the marketing was targeting the male who was apparently then providing the Serapaks. Anyway, it's kind of creepy, but I wanted to include that just so that you understand that there was this real gendered kind of framing around benzo use initially when they were first marketed, and some of that's still seen in some of the stats to this day. In Australia, benzos are super popular. In 2019, there was nearly 5 million PBS benzo scripts dispensed. Now that's only the PBS subsidised one, so that doesn't include doesn't include private scripts. Also doesn't include hospital administered whatever. So probably an underestimate of what's in the community. Household survey, which is, I mean, possibly controversial opinion, increasingly unreliable in its ability to give us an accurate picture of this sort of data. But 3.9% of Australians aged over 14 said that they'd used quote unquote tranquilizers for non-medical purposes. There was a slight decline actually in that stat over the previous household survey, although again, take that with a grain of salt. The other thing just to note, real-time prescription monitoring kind of rolled out across most Australian states from about 2019 to 2022. I think Tasmania had already had it before that. But from 2022, all states have now got, and territories have got a version of real-time prescription monitoring. I just flagged that because I do wonder whether some of what we're talking about with regards to counterfeit benzos at the moment are linked to this kind of real-time prescription monitoring and changes in the way that benzos are managed. And just to think about that, I mean, I started working in alcohol and drugs in the early 2000s, and it was just at the end of Rohypnol. Rohypnol was the recreational benzo throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s. Obviously, Rohypnol is associated with amnesia, and it's got a pretty common perception of it being associated with things like sexual assault in terms of blacking someone's memory out. But it was also a highly sort of recreational kind of benzo, and a lot of people enjoyed taking it. Rohypnol was made a Schedule 8 benzo in the late 90s, early 2000s. And when it was made Schedule 8, it was basically removed from the market. There was no more real easy availability for it to be prescribed. And so you just saw it basically disappear. Around the same time that this was happening, there was a heroin drought, which a lot of people here will be familiar with this story. We saw a big upswing in temazepam gel caps, the little green footies, which people are injecting and causing lots and lots of harm. Those were withdrawn from the market. We saw then, conversion to diphenhydramine and other similar products, particularly in Victoria. But we also saw probably in I'd say 2006 to 2008, I know I was working at the time in outer suburbs of Brisbane in drug and alcohol. I started to see Xanax becoming a really popular sort of benzo that people started using around about that kind of time. So where we're at right now is part of a long-running game of sort of cat and mouse with, problematic benzo restrictions, new problematic benzo restrictions, and I think that that's a crucial part of understanding what we're talking about today. Is that this is part of an ongoing sort of pattern that we've been through before. So what are the benzos used for? I mean, they've got a whole bunch of really useful clinical actions. They work on GABA receptor sites, and on the left, you can see the different actions of benzos. Now, these different actions are associated with particular GABA receptor sites. Now, I am overgeneralizing neurotransmitters for a popular audience, so don't get too geeky on me with this, but there are other neurotransmitters involved as well. But in general, there is a set of different GABA receptor sites, and each of those receptor sites has a slightly different action in terms of either reducing anxiety, inducing sleep, muscle relaxation, preventing seizures, or amnesia. The different types of benzos that are available, and there's a range of prescribed benzos available, they all work slightly in a different way, in different sort of affinities to these different receptor sites, so that they have either more of an anti-anxiety function or maybe more of a sleep function. And that's why we see these different types of benzos and all of the different reasons that they might be prescribed. And I just wanted to raise this because as we see novel benzos coming out that are so new that we actually don't really know anything about them, when you start to hear the client reports around how the client describes some of the effects, you can actually start to make some guesses as to which of these GABA receptor sites these new benzos might be connecting to. And from that, we can start to guess where some of the harms might be as well, because some of these different actions are associated with different types of harms that we might see in our clients. Something else just to keep in mind as well is that the different benzos, the prescribed benzos that are available, as well as having slightly different action across the different GABA receptor sites to induce these different sorts of actions, there's also the different speed of onset and half-life, and that's really important as well in terms of what gets prescribed for what. So a drug like alprazolam or Xanax has a relatively short onset, and that's because it's prescribed for panic attacks. If you're having a panic attack, you don't want to wait an hour for your medication to come on. You want it to come on really quickly and fix your panic attack. So a drug like alprazolam has that short onset and relatively short half-life compared to others, whereas something like maybe clonazepam has got a bit of a longer onset but a much longer action. So if you were taking that, for example, to manage seizures, then you obviously want that sort of longer coverage. It might not help you in the short term, but it will help you a little bit longer. So I will share these slides afterwards as well, so don't worry about madly scrambling to get all this down. But this is a little bit old now, but these are just some of the different trade names of the different products, the actual benzo that's inside, and the time to peak concentration, which is actually a little bit different to the onset time. This is time to peak plasma concentration. Onset can be a bit shorter. Elimination half-life, which is how long it takes your body to get rid of half of the drug from your system, and a dose equivalent as well. And the dose equivalents, I'm only going to include that here because traditionally that's how you would manage, like one of the ways you would look at managing a benzo withdrawal. If say someone's using alprazolam, we'd want to convert their alprazolam dosage over to a diazepam dosage, and that would be what we might hold them on in terms of managing those withdrawals before we start to drop them off a bit. Dose equivalence with novel benzos goes out the door because they're too new for us to know what to make them equivalent of. Obviously, you don't use dose equivalence charts just straight up to convert someone and then just prescribe them that. It is always just a guide, but it's sort of, I think it is useful because a lot of us understand what 5 milligrams diazepam might look like in a client, probably not too much, just a little bit relaxed. But from understanding dose equivalence, you can start to understand then what would 10 milligrams of alprazolam look like, for example. So there's some of the common ones, and there's a few others as well. Again, we will share this after today's talk, so you've got a copy of it. I did just want to share this slide. This comes from a presentation from an Insight webinar. Actually, I think this is July 2019. That might be a typo in there. COVID time is a very weird time. But this is a presentation from Karen Blakey and Andrew Griffiths, who were chemists working with, at the time, Queensland Forensic Scientific Services, as it was known, so that they do either the toxicology, where people have had like motor vehicle accidents or have passed away, but also some of the seizures of actual tablets as well. And so this is a slide from that presentation. I really recommend go back and have a look at this presentation from 2019. You can just Google it if you want to have a look. What I think, like, looking back on it now, Karen and Andrew really described the emergence of these novel benzos very accurately, because this is where you can see on this graph the different types of so-called designer benzos are being discovered in Queensland, and really not very much happening for a long time. Phenazepam was one that we did see around in the late sort of 2009, 2010, and in a pretty low kind of level. But look at 2019, all of a sudden there's this like very large spike in itazolam detections. And so this sort of lines up a bit anecdotally with what we were also starting to see just in here in client reports. Some of the client reports that actually, I'll just, whoops, now I'm going too far ahead. Hang on, I've got my slides around the wrong order. Let me just fix this. And it was about 2018 when I was working in Queensland Health in our secondary consultation role, that we got reports from youth services on the south side of Brisbane of young people reporting to use counterfeit Xanax. And we'd heard of counterfeit Xanax from overseas, particularly from the UK, where there had been a fair bit of media reporting around it. Some very clever youth workers managed to get a photograph of one of those counterfeit Xanax tablets in 2018 and shared that with us. And very visibly, obviously, a counterfeit Xanax. It did not look right. It looked too big. It looked very crumbly. But also, at around this time, Xanax, alprazolam, had been made a Schedule 8 in Australia, and Pfizer had withdrawn it from the market, knowing that there's not much market for them anymore. And I'm talking about Pfizer brand name Xanax here. So the Pfizer brand name Xanax was removed from the market in 2018. There probably was still some supply in pharmacies and elsewhere for a little bit, but that's well and truly gone. So we saw this sort of emergence in the south side of Brisbane of counterfeit Xanax tablets. We saw it spreading actually across mostly school-age young people. Was the really unusual kind of feature of that early sort of emergence, was that it was particularly in school-age young people. They were buying them for $5 a tablet. We weren't actually seeing them in our NSPs or amongst our clients that use opioids, our older clients. It was very much confined to younger people. So we saw it got picked up by Child Youth Mental Health Services in particular, started to pick it up and started phoning us, because in their assessments, they were starting to get young people reporting Xanax use, which didn't seem right because it's not easy to get. But we also started to pick up at that time unplanned withdrawals occurring from young people who had had a mental health admission or an admission for some unrelated reason, and then mysteriously started to go into what was later found out to be benzo withdrawal. Around about the same time, we also got reports, again on the south side and Gold Coast in particular, from Youth Justice Services, and they were reporting to us. One Youth Justice Service Centre in particular reported a whole new cohort of young people had committed offences and were now on their books, and that these were, as they described them, more middle class kind of kids than what they often would otherwise see at Youth Justice, and that they were all of them had committed crimes under the influence of benzos, which they had no recollection of. And these were often, out of character, disinhibited style behaviour, stupid kinds of things, really, that people would do under the influence of benzos and then end up in legal trouble. So we really started to pick this up around 2018-19, sort of anecdotally. There was also then, in about 2019, a fairly significant police seizure on the south side of Brisbane of alprazolam powder, along with an alprazolam tablet stamp, which I think proved what we might have thought, which was that these were being pressed as tablets locally, and that explained the kind of high level of supply. What is a little bit unusual, though, is that even now the supply of counterfeit benzos is fairly restricted in Queensland anyway, to southeast Queensland and a couple of major centres like Townsville. We don't actually see counterfeit benzos spreading across the entire regional communities in Queensland, which is unusual. Most drugs do spread everywhere, but we do still see them to be a little bit contained. So let me just jump ahead to What are the counterfeit benzos that we're seeing? So the first one that we noticed from that previous slide was itazolam. And itazolam was really, really popular back around that time. I think it's probably less popular now, and we haven't really seen it so much. Itazolam, these dosage information here is with an asterisk next to it, because this has often been taken from user reports as best we can, basically. So it's not sciencey information. This is basically trying to put together whatever we can on what we think the duration and the onset might be. Atazolam, though very similar to Xanax in its onset and duration and after effects, is fairly closely analogous. We also saw in this initial data, this came from the data we were getting from like forensic services or toxicology services. Flualprazolam was the other one that they were encountering, also flubromazolam as well for those probably first couple of years. What I want to talk about, though, for most of this presentation is bromazolam. Bromazolam, and this is true globally, bromazolam sort of came to take over as the most common counterfeit benzo, I'd say maybe 2 years ago. It could even be longer than that. But it really has spread all around the world, and a very, very significant proportion of counterfeit benzo presentations turn out to be bromazolam. And that's definitely been the case for us at CheQpoint. Bromazolam is basically the only novel benzo that we keep detecting. And I'll talk you through a little bit of that in a sec. Something just to keep in mind though, bromazolam, I mean, we're always playing this sort of catch up kind of game. Bromazolam was scheduled earlier this year at the UN meeting in Vienna back in March or April. And so it is now illegal in China, which some of this may have been sourced from China. So we're kind of expecting bromazolam could be on the way out, and we could be ready for a switch to a new novel benzo. Each of these benzos have at some point, the novel benzos have at some point been scheduled, which results in them being, disappearing eventually, and then another one coming out. There could well be huge supplies of bromazolam in the community, and so it could take a while for it to wash out. But my guess is that bromazolam will wash out, and we'll end up with the next one. Who knows what the next one is? There's been some talk already of diazepam. Try and say that really quickly. It's a really hard one. What's interesting about the diazepam is the significant half-life, like up to 86-hour half-life, which is very long. That means that stays in your system. If you just take, 1 or 2 days a week, it's in your system a lot of the time, which could cause a whole bunch of issues. Something else I should have noted a bit earlier, actually, too. A number of benzos, in particular diazepam as an example, have active metabolites, which are when the drug is being metabolized in your body, part of the drug is metabolized into another compound, which is itself psychoactive. In some cases, the active metabolites can have a longer duration of effect, which can increase the length of time that the benzos are on board. And someone who's taking them, say, every day or most days, can get those sort of active metabolites can really build up in their body. Something that is really interesting about bromazolam, and it's come up for us with our clients, is where we first really detected this, is clients reporting when they've had a significant dose of bromazolam, and there seems to be a dose tipping point because it doesn't happen at lower doses, but high doses of bromazolam seems to induce multi-day amnesia. And what I'll do is just let me show you a tablet. Okay, this is a Xanax tablet that was presented to CheQpoint back in May of this year. The person who purchased this had purchased this off a encrypted communications app. So this was an in-person purchase off an encrypted communications app. They were seeking out Xanax. You can see each of those squares is 1 centimeter. That's a very large tablet. It's quite big. And this person had took one of these tablets and had 5 days of amnesia and has no recollection of the next 5 days. Obviously, very frightening kind of experience to have that much amnesia. The person was really distressed about it. What they reported, which was really interesting, was that this person was around family members at the time. The family report no disinhibited behavior or no evidence of sedation. It looked like it was just straight amnesia. And if we go back to the slide with all of the different actions of the benzos, it's what I'm starting to wonder is that, firstly, is there an active metabolite of bromozolam so that if you take enough of it, some other kind of benzo compound is produced in your body, which it might be. But is there some real selective action on this amnesic GABA receptor site? And it might be. After this encounter with our client, who had this. Now we tested this. We use FTIR in our drug checking service, and FTIR is usually accurate until we get to drugs where their concentration is less than 5%. And that's often the case with benzos. Like we would expect 2 milligrams of bromozolam or alprazolam in a tablet like that. So usually we should just pick up the binder. What we're finding though, and what we found in this case was that actually we did get a detection of bromozolam on the FTIR. Not initially. Initially, we just got cellulose, which would be the tablet binder. But the chemist just did a really simple acetone wash just to try and wash out some of that binder and then just retest it. And when we've retested it following the acetone wash, we've got a decent confidence match for bromozolam, which we then got confirmed at secondary analysis. So the fact that we're getting a confirmation on an FTIR probably indicates there's a decent concentration in these tablets. Now, FTIR can't give a dosage, but it can give you some clues that, and putting that together with a client report of a single tablet inducing a 5-day blackout probably means that that's a serious overdose situation there in a single tablet. To help you remember how to pronounce diazepam, I just sort of put that there. We're trying to make it stick. Diazepam, it's actually not how you say it, but I think that we can make it stick. I want to show you just some of the other benzos that we've been detecting at CheQpoint, some of which weirdly contain the actual product on the bottle. And here's one. This is a Alpha Farm Karma. So this is a brand name. This is produced in Australia, these tablets. This is the new appearance Karma. So Karma tablets used to be in the brick form, the classic brick form that looks a lot like Pfizer Xanax bar. But they've actually reformulated into this style because of the counterfeits that have been appearing. So this new style Alpha Farm product came on the market, I think at the beginning of this year. And so we had a sample of these dropped off and we've tested them and it has contained alprazolam as expected. So that is a legit one. And so we definitely have seen some legit benzos out there that are what they say on the box. This is another one, expected alprazolam and detected alprazolam as well. Now, this is a blister pack. This is a person who has reported purchasing this from an overseas pharmacy, in-person overseas pharmacy, not through the mail. And this has come back expected and detected as alprazolam. Something that is interesting for us so far, although take this with a grain of salt, is that we haven't yet seen counterfeit benzos coming in a blister pack. All of the blister packs that we've had presented to us have turned out to be as expected. So there's a warning with that though, because in places like the UK, that's definitely not the case. And in the UK, other countries, there definitely are blister pack counterfeits that contain novel benzos. We just haven't actually seen them through CheQpoint as yet. Some of them are obviously from overseas pharmacies in that they've got different languages on them. But so far, we've expected and detected alprazolam in some of those samples. Here's a couple of the more unusual ones. This was our expected alprazolam. This is a Pfizer bottle. Now, this was an American Pfizer bottle. This is not like an Australian style. You can see how dodgy does that tablet look. No pharmaceutical company made that. You don't need an spectrometer to tell you that. But what was interesting here is the client had actually, this had been in the client's bottom drawer for 12 months or so. They went in as white tablets and they came out kind of purple. It's a bit hard to see in the lighting there, but these tablets were a bit purple, which is sort of weird and obviously really quite crumbly. We weren't able to get a result on our FTIR in the lab on these, so we've had to send them off for secondary confirmation. And what we got, we did detect alprazolam as the only benzo ingredient. There was no other psychoactive ingredients, but we got methyl palmitate and tert butyrhydroquinone, TBHQ, which is a food additive. So we are wondering whether this TBHQ has been added deliberately to give the tablet a bitter taste. Some of you probably know, I mean, I've definitely had heaps of clients tell me that they can tell the counterfeit Xanax from the real because the real Xanax tastes bitter, but then just put some bitter tasting stuff in the counterfeit benzos. And we've heard this also from our forensic labs in Queensland as well, that they have detected what we are assuming are bittering agents that are added for the purposes of making the tablet taste like what people expect. So when you hear clients say things like, "Oh, yeah, no, if it's bitter, then it's probably real," um, not so true. That actually may not be the case. This is another one. These have been detected elsewhere. I think CanTest have detected these. These are also very popular in the US and have been detected over there a number of times. This was a counterfeit diazepam tablet, not from an Australian style brand, but we were able to confirm bromazepam with this one. And I think actually we actually got a bromazepam hit on the FTIR from memory on that one as well, indicating probably fairly concentrated. We've also seen a number of presentations of bromazepam powder in pure style powder form, and we have been getting clear results for these powdered products on the FTIR as well. That's one that we detected also back in May. Just an anecdote around the clients that we're seeing present with counterfeit benzos at CheQpoint are a little bit different to some of our other clients in that I'd say the majority of our benzo presenting clients are not really presenting using these in recreational kinds of ways. We do occasionally see people who might use a benzo to come down off stimulants, but the majority of the people we're seeing presenting with counterfeit benzos are reporting that they're self-medicating mental health concerns in almost all of the cases. So it's not really a sort of recreational, so-called recreational kind of pattern that we're seeing in this client group. We are seeing there's a subgroup of presentations we're seeing of people who are reporting social anxiety as their primary reason for using. We've also picked up a couple of people on the autism spectrum who are reporting social anxiety, and so then using the counterfeit benzos to help sort of manage that. We've seen people with phobias. In one case we had someone who has quite a severe flying phobia, and her GP refused to prescribe her any benzos for the flight phobia. So she's sourced her own benzos on the internet. And we've seen other people reporting things like severe anxiety disorders as well. What's been a bit tricky though is particularly people with reporting using benzos for anxiety is that it's really hard. We're seeing people with emerging signs of dependence, and it's tricky to know how much of their anxiety is actually drug induced or not, chicken or egg kind of thing, what started what. But we're definitely seeing people who are with emerging symptoms of benzodependence and actually right through to really severe benzodependence in a number of cases. We have had some real concerning presentations where including just one that I can think of someone who had a booked admission for detox, which was not for another week, and so needed to maintain their benzo consumption so they didn't go into withdrawal until their booked admission was ready. Now that's really tough because like we know we can test a tablet and tell you what we think might be in there. What we know though from the more comprehensive data from forensics where they've had whole bottles is that the doses are different in every single tablet. And the benzos can be different in every single tablet as well. And I think we've heard cases where within a bottle there are some tablets with no active ingredients and some with very high levels of benzos. And in some we have had nitazines turn up in counterfeit benzos as well. So a really tricky scenario for advising a client in how to say manage benzodependence in a safely before accessing treatment. Also in terms of a drug checking service though, really challenging because what advice do we give the client? Well, I can tell you what's in that tablet, but your next tablet in the same bottle, who knows? And so actually the client needs to be really cautious on every single tablet in that bottle. And when we explain that to people, they get a bit like, oh, well, this is a bugger because, what as a drug checking service, what can we offer? I mean, I can tell you what's in that tablet on our FTIR today, but I can't tell you much else. And with benzos, the counterfeit benzos, they're kind of all over the place. Just in terms of though the tolerance issue with benzos and the interaction of benzo consumption and anxiety symptoms in particular, there's a double whammy that happens when people are using GABA receptor drugs. Like alcohol is the classic one as well. There's a kind of two-part tolerance mechanism. There's a down regulation of the adenosine inhibitory system that helps keep you calm, and then an upregulation of the glutamate excitatory system that makes you anxious. So you're getting this double whammy. A lot of people are familiar, and actually we use this when we talk to clients. A lot of people are familiar with alcohol, anxiety. If you are hungover and you feel anxiety as a part of your hangover, some of that probably is to do with this GABA receptors being overactivated and this sort of this very, very short term kind of very miniature little version of withdrawal that occurs during your hangover. When people are using benzos, even fairly infrequently, this tolerance will happen really fast, including if you just binge on benzos over the weekend, you can get rebound anxiety on the Monday, Tuesday afterwards. I think we've seen clients where it looks like they're starting to go, oh, I'm anxious, I take more benzos, I feel good, and then getting stuck into that cycle of dependence from there. And really, it becomes very challenging because, I mean, what came first? Who knows? What's the treatment option? Well, try to withdraw you and see what's left. And that's pretty traumatic for a lot of clients who've got no other, supports to manage those kinds of symptoms. So there's a real challenge for us as a system in terms of what are we actually offering these people who are our experience is that they're looking for some relief for their anxiety symptoms. And our service system, our drug and alcohol system will withdraw you. Our mental health system for a lot of these clients, they're not severe enough for the public system, but they're too complex for their GPs. And that's what we keep on kind of seeing. It's worth just keeping an eye on benzo withdrawal risk. I mean, it's something we've been, our staff are really across because we're really nervous about this. As we get into some looking at new benzos emerging, like what are the things we need to look for? Short-acting benzo means short onset withdrawal. Longer-acting benzo means a longer onset for the withdrawal symptoms. So we get really concerned about short onset benzos, short half-life benzos with that short withdrawal onset because that can catch you out where someone could go into withdrawal within a couple of days of their last tablet. On the flip side, though, the longer acting benzos, because those withdrawal symptoms won't come on for 5 to 7 days, sometimes people don't join the dots that me anxious in a week is related to the drugs I took 7 days ago. Who would think that? But so it's just worth sort of keeping that in mind. With bromazepam having what looks a bit like a dual action, we're not quite sure where it lands. I think it's probably partway in the middle there, that it could have some of those minor withdrawal symptoms appearing fairly quickly, but possibly extending off for a fair while as well. There's a bit of like, how do you manage benzo withdrawal? I mean, we try to, like, if it's really, really minor, you just want to try to keep people, like, if there's no sort of seizure risk or really serious withdrawal complication risk, sleep problems are the major distressing feature that people will talk about. And if possible, a non-benzo drug to help manage that could be really good. Although if that's not always possible for a lot of people as well. So there's just some information there around some of the psychosocial interventions, but also what some of the medication interventions might look like as well, based on how severe someone could be presenting. I just wanted to flag this too. This is the benzo withdrawal scale. I mean, these withdrawal scales are super problematic. They're super not valid. So don't use them in real life unless you've got some strong clinical judgment and some strong clinical support. But I just wanted to flag it because I find this quite useful for staff to understand this is what you would be looking for in a client that might be having some withdrawal symptoms. So this is a CYB. I'll give you some info on how to you get this off the Insight website. But this is basically what you'd be looking for, like restlessness and agitation. Have they got any kind of tremor or sweatiness? And then some of the patient self-reports around irritability, fatigue, feeling tense, trouble concentrating, appetite. Something that is a little bit unusual is that I think there are some really weird benzo withdrawal symptoms that sound like really neurological kinds of symptoms that people get really distressed about. Numbness or burning in hands and feet. People can get some really weird tingling, heart palpitations. They can also, these are some of the other ones, people can get light sensitive to light and sound, like all of a sudden being in crowded places, I can't handle all of the noise. So some quite unusual, and the visual disturbances as well. So I've put that there for you as staff to have a look at, and just think about that when you're working with a client, whether any of those things might be coming up. Some of the short-term effects, you probably all know this, I mean, they're GABA receptor agonists, so they work the same way as alcohol does. It has all of the really similar kinds of effects, like slowing down reaction times and things like that. There is definitely sort of tipping point where you see that the higher doses, the benzos tend to induce more of the amnesic effects. Whereas often, if people are using benzos recreationally, most of those recreational effects are associated with lower dose benzos. Once they cross over into the higher doses, then being blacked out isn't always a super recreational thing. So the big risk too is in this really combining benzos with other drugs. So benzos were invented to replace barbiturates because they don't do as profound respiratory depression as the barbiturates do. But if you combine it with things like alcohol or other types of CNS depressants, ketamine, GHB, etc., then you will get those issues. You can also get just a very straight up someone being slow to be roused and choking on their vomit. The longer term effects, I mean, there's a whole bunch of quite scary research looking at particularly elderly people who've been prescribed diazepam for 30 and 40 years. Like, does this lead to cognitive decline? And look, that research is not complete, but there are and there's different opinions in the research on that. But there's some pretty scary papers that are seeming to indicate long-term, particularly longer-term benzo use leading to cognitive decline. It's definitely been noticed in the sort of aged care arena of benzo's contributions to falls and accidents and other types of things that elderly people can experience as well. The big, I mentioned already the big issues with the combos and interactions with the other CNS depressants, but mostly the GABA drugs in particular, alcohol, opioids, but also things like inhalants. I know for me, working with young people, that's one we definitely see would be volatile hydrocarbons in particular, glue, paint, petrol, and butane in deodorants. Interacting with benzos, and what it would often do would make them pass out while the inhalant is active, and then they'll get back up again, but then be really woozy and much more disinhibited than they might be otherwise. Just some tips in terms of our harm reduction advice for people who are using benzos. I mean, our harm reduction advice is harms occur from this interaction of drug person environment, and so we're looking to try to reduce harm across those domains as well. But it's not quite enough. The framework we've been using within the loop is this sort of the concept of insight, ability, motivation with regards to harm reduction advice as well. So insight into the risk. Does the client have insight and understand the risk and how it applies to them? Have they got ability to implement risk reduction strategies? Like, can they actually do the thing we're asking of them? Some of the risk reduction strategies involve money or tools or stuff that people don't have or that they can't have because they'll get arrested. And the last one is motivation. Does the person actually really want to do this? If the person is, either really depressed or really serious trauma symptoms, then the benzos are actually serving a really important need for them. And so to say, well, you should probably reduce or, maybe think about detox, it isn't super useful for those people because they don't have a drug problem. They have a sobriety problem. Some of the advice, though, we do give people is don't inject the benzos. They're not water soluble, including the powders that people see. However, if they are a regular injector and if they know what they're doing and they've got access to resources, there are ways of doing it. And when we go back to the insight, ability, motivation slide, this is for clients with a high degree of ability. The propylene glycol will dissolve benzos. Now, I wouldn't routinely advise that unless you've got a client that is very, very fixated on doing it or possibly already doing it, already trying to inject benzos with water. When they do inject them, mix them up with water and the benzo doesn't fully dissolve, that will cause really severe irritation in the linings of their veins. Some of the tablet fragments, if they use a wheel filter, they may actually filter a bunch of the benzo out. So if they don't use a wheel filter, then a bunch of the fragments will end up in their lungs and inside their heart valves. So super, super, super dangerous to do that. Also, oral benzos have really high bioavailability. So most of what you take orally does become available. And even when people inject them, that some of these benzos still have a slightly delayed onset of action. So they're not always getting the thing that they think they're getting from injecting, which is that rapid onset and the rush kind of thing. So generally try to advise just to don't do it. Those who are very committed to it, propylene glycol, it's possible. If you are interested in that, drop me an email. There are some online guides on how to advise someone around that. But again, super careful as to who gets that information and who's able to actually implement it safely. If someone might be dependent, don't stop taking them suddenly. A lot of people don't realize this. So some of this is around actually showing a client those withdrawal onset graphs so that the person can go, oh, right, 7 to 10 days after, that's why I feel really bad, because they may not always be joining the dots between those sort of symptoms that they're getting and their benzo use because of the delayed onset of some of those effects. Also, there are people that we've come across that are having some quite serious withdrawal symptoms who just totally did not know that that was a withdrawal symptom at all until we kind of pointed it out to them. Another one, this has come from clients that we work with. Because benzos induce amnesia, sometimes people forget they've taken benzos and then they take more benzos. So put them away after you've started taking them, or if someone is planning to use benzos on the weekend, to put them out, set your dose out, like get however many tablets you are planning on taking and put the rest away so that the person has an ability to remember how much they've taken. Benzos at high doses will create what sort of goldfish-like memory in the person where they forget what they're doing while they're doing it. Definitely worked with people, ripping out blister packs of benzos, and I'm like, hey man, you just had some. And they're like, no, I didn't. And I'm like, oh, you can't remember 5 minutes ago. So it does mean people can accidentally overdose just because they're disinhibited and amnesic. Don't mix depressants, including things like alcohol. I mean, a lot of people do this though, and I think people do it and it's fine, and then they think it's actually no big deal and everyone's just overstating it. But really, I think Rita mentioned some of those overdose death stats before, and that's, we see the big driver is the way that these have commonly been mixed, particularly with simple things like alcohol. And looking at some of the stats from overseas, particularly places like Scotland, it's like these novel benzos have got a huge role to play in fatal overdose. We also want to educate people about tolerance because tolerance is something a lot of people will notice that they have to take more to get the same effects. So tolerance is a great bridge for a conversation into withdrawal because where someone's developing tolerance, they are by default developing some withdrawal-like symptoms as well as they get that sort of neuroadaptation kicking in. But tolerance is something that the client will notice, and it gives us a good way to start having that conversation. Watch out for bad behaviour under the influence. And in terms of service delivery, this is a bit of a tricky one. I know in youth services, we're always struggling with this because we'd have a young person in the youth service who would kick off while benzo affected, and they'd be asked to leave the service, and then they come back the next day, and normally we would sit down and have a conversation about, hey, your behaviour yesterday wasn't great, and let's talk about that. But it's really hard because the person doesn't remember it at all. And so then how do you have a kind of your behavior was not acceptable, let's try to not do that next time kind of conversation in a supportive way with someone who doesn't remember it. So the disinhibited behavior is tricky to manage in the moment because it is erratic and people's behavior can swing pretty quick. And people who we know to be normally pretty chill can become pretty not chill pretty quick, but it's also a bit hard to work out how we address it with them afterwards as well. This was a case from Queensland from last year where there was some counterfeit Xanax that was found to contain nitazene. There were some deaths associated with this one as well. So we routinely use nitazene test strips on all our benzo presentations now. What was interesting in one of these cases is that a number of the tablets were seized in this incident. And out of that, they did not all contain nitazene in the bottle, only some did. And there were varying doses of benzos as well in there. There is another paper that has been published by Karen Blakey and her colleagues looking at some of the other contents that's found in the different counterfeit benzos. It's worth having a look at because the doses are all over the place and it makes it really hard to give people accurate info. But because nitazenes have turned up in counterfeit benzos, anyone who uses benzos should be advised to get naloxone because we would probably expect this to happen again, that there'll be nitazenes out there again. Also want to give a bit of a shout out to the Insight Check tools. They've got a great tool called Benzo Check, which is a really simple little quick assessment you can do with someone on their benzo use. And then if they want to make changes, there's some structured little worksheets to go through with the client who wants to make change. If they don't want to make change, then there's a really cool harm reduction checklist. And I've got it on the screen here. It just goes through some really common harm reduction strategies, and you had a conversation with the client. Do you reckon you'd try this out? If yes, cool. If no, why not? Is there anything we can do to support you and being a bit safer? Also, there's some great online learning packages, one just on the basics of benzos, but another one on withdrawal management. Really great content on the Insight website, totally free for anyone to complete those online, and highly recommend it. And finally, there's our contact details for CheQpoint. The Quinn website has all the details. Otherwise, follow us on the socials. And there's my contact details as well. If you wanted to get in touch, drop me a line and I'm more than happy to chat. Thank you, Rita.
Amazing, Cameron. Thank you so much. What a great discussion. You honestly covered most of the questions that we had ahead of the session, as well as during the session, as almost as they came up. So that was fantastic. We do only have 4 or 5 minutes left before we wrap up. I might just touch on the naloxone side of things. Obviously, it's becoming more and more of a market where really everybody should be carrying naloxone, ideally, because things can pop up anywhere. But I think sometimes there's a bit of a confusion around the use of naloxone and people not coming around and people thinking they need extra doses because it's a really strong opioid. But I think there might be some crossover with polydrug use and or benzodiazepine use where it's actually not an opioid, and that benzo overdoses can look a little bit like an opioid overdose, particularly if you don't know the person and what they've been taking. So is there any advice on how people should proceed if they do use naloxone and a person isn't responding?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because it's just so hard to know like what might be going on. The naloxone is obviously great, like first port of call to do in the event that someone's ended up like that with respiratory depression and loss of consciousness. But then I'd be calling the ambulance again pretty quickly as well to try and get additional assistance. I know there's been real concerns about, like in North America, so-called benzo dope, so counterfeit benzos mixed in with fentanyl analogs and other types of opioids, and that then in those cases the naloxone may reverse the opioid component of that, but not the benzo component of that, which means the person may come out of the sort of acute loss of consciousness, but could become really disinhibited because now the benzo effects are still really prominent. So it can get really confusing in terms of how the person's presenting like that. But I think in any case like that, be starting with naloxone, follow the usual protocol, start with naloxone, and then call the ambulance because we don't know what's going to happen next. Yeah.
Which is essentially what we would recommend where possible anyway, because we want people to get extra health support if they have been administered naloxone and experienced an overdose. I'm so sorry that we can't get through more questions because I have a bunch, even though I'm not the audience today. Thank you again. It's been really fantastic. You've held the fort for nearly 50 minutes straight. So that's really incredible of you and for making time with us. To our audience, I just want to say stay tuned for more webinars in our 2025 series. We will have some more information on that coming in the new year. We do, before we wrap up, just want to do a shout out to stick around to complete the brief pop-up feedback survey that pops up at the end of the session. This really helps guide us with what to include and how to improve things. And just once again, Cameron, thanks so much for your time, for your insights. I'm going to pop some of those links that you've shared in your slides, but also your slides up with the recording when it's available. It should be, I'm looking at my watch, before the end of the year. Pennington Institute is closing down from the 24th of December through to just after New Year's. So if it's not up just before then, it won't be too far away, I promise. But otherwise, I'm wishing everyone a really safe season. Look after your friends, look after your mates, look after your clients, and have some good times along the way. And we will see you in the new year. Thanks again, Cam.
Thanks, Rita. Thanks, everybody.